Hi, it's Dwyer. It is early morning Sunday, March 16th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. Also, always 1776, a free site. And Money 1776, a free site. Nothing I say in this video should be construed as investment advice. Right? I want everyone to do their own due diligence. I'm just sharing how I see things and what I'm doing. Right? Again, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, let me make a point here, and I know it's going to sound completely ridiculous, right? You're the President of the United States. You look around and you realize the current situation is unsustainable, right? The multiples in terms of how many times your median income you would have to spend to put a child through college, to buy a house in a working class or middle class neighborhood are elevated right now, right? Even the price of things like utilities are elevated because of the increased competition for electricity. So we've reached the point where the middle class can no longer afford the American dream. Now, what do you do? And I'm about to engage in speculation, but it's reasoned speculation. You look back in history on how past presidents dealt with situations like this, right? One of the best, in my opinion, and he's not thought of as a great president for a host of reasons, right? In my opinion, he actually was one of our better presidents. Warren G. Harding in 1920 inherits a depression, right? The United States had just spent a lot of money that it really didn't have in World War I, what they call the Great War. They didn't know that there would be a World War II. They thought that that Great War was the height of combat, that it wouldn't happen again. So the U.S. spent like a drunken sailor. And of course, Warren G. Harding decides that he's going to cut the federal budget. Right? He's not bailing out anyone. He's just reducing the public sector. In his mind, he thought that that would free up money for the free market. And believe it or not, he was right. Warren G. Harding gave us the Roaring Twenties. Right? Harding, for historical types here, also did some interesting things. Right? He actually meets with black nationalist Marcus Garvey, who recently received a pardon from Joe Biden before he left office. Right? Understand, too, Harding gives the first speech in American history by a president south of the Mason-Dixon line condemning lynching. Right? Harding, really an interesting person. I believe we associate him with the Teapot Dome scandal, and we don't look at all of what he had to offer. Well, let's talk about a more recent time where a president faced an economic catastrophe. what I want people to do, and older people will remember this moment. You had a president of the United States who did not want to engage in a presidential debate. He gave in. He decided to engage in one debate. That president was Jimmy Carter, right? One of our best ex-presidents in history. But as a president, Jimmy Carter was, let's say, less than successful, right? At one point, America had a problem paying for energy. A lot of people were going cold in the winter. Carter gave a national speech. He was wearing a sweater. His message was that people had to wear sweaters and hunker down to get through a cold winter. Right? The Carter administration used to hand out buttons. They would have the word whip on them. Right? It was, in fact, they'd have the word win on them, which stood for whip inflation now. So he had a debate against someone who was viewed as an extremist, a guy who had lost the Republican nomination in 1976. You can tell it's early in the morning here, right? Ronald Reagan. And Reagan talked about what he called the misery index, right? The inflation rate plus the unemployment rate. Right? Reagan was talking about the need for a change. Reagan won the 1980 presidential election, beating the incumbent. Right? Carter, by the way, at the debate, was basically calling Reagan an extremist, someone who was selfish, someone who did not care about working class Americans. Right? That debate is really a watershed moment in American politics. Well, let me tell you what happened next. Carter had a head of the Fed, Paul Volcker. And Volcker was bold. So here you have a new president, Ronald Reagan. And Reagan allows Volcker, at a time of stagflation, to raise interest rates. Right, folks? During my life, you never got a better rate of return on a U.S. bond, sovereign bond. Right? You had treasuries up around 15%. Imagine getting paid 15% interest from a debtor as reliable as the American government for 30 years. Folks, the daredevils at the beginning of the Reagan administration were able to do just that. Right? Talk to old-timers about the mortgage rates they were paying. It was completely out of control. Now understand, what Volcker was doing was he was bleeding out inflation from the economy. He was doing so by making credit expensive. What it did is it crashed the U.S. economy. I laugh because it's so unbelievable. I actually lived through that era, right? Much younger, lived through that era. Then the economy started roaring back. In other words, Reagan crashed the economy like Warren Harding crashed the economy. By the time we get to 1984, Reagan is running against Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale. And Reagan wins the 84 election by a landslide. Let me tell you how different 84 was from what came before it. The stock market is flat from about 1968 to 1982. It's flat. I can tell you I went to high school in the Bronx, right? And it was a well-known high school. It still is. Bronx High School of Science in New York City. And at this high school, my class didn't have anyone. And you had a lot of wealthy kids in the high school. A lot of wealthy parents had kids in the high school. I wasn't wealthy, but, let's just say I was talking to friends and they were living in affluent neighborhoods throughout New York City. Just understand that I can't recall a single person at Bronx High School of Science in the early 1980s who wanted to work on Wall Street. Folks, being an investment banker just was not viewed as glamorous. Wall Street was a backwater, right? Look at some of the most successful investors of the last 20 years. People like Jim Chanos, right? Look at investors who are about, let's say, 65 to 70, and get their thoughts on working on Wall Street. The movie Wall Street, 1987, Michael Douglas, wasn't possible. Simply was not possible in 1981. Because working on Wall Street was not viewed as glamorous. I know it's hard to believe, right? In this era of hedge funds and Series A and Series B funding, back then, understand, you didn't have all this private equity, right? People just had a lot of stagflation, thought Wall Street was for underachievers, right? It was more glamorous to be a doctor or a lawyer. People didn't equate investment banking with glamorous professions. A college wanted me to interview with some alumni. The alumni worked on Wall Street. So after school one day, I went to the interview. And I can tell you, the building was not glamorous. It was mostly empty. There was none of the energy you see in shows like Billions. Right? None of the energy. Right? And I was talking with the alum, and let's just say I was looking at him, and these interviews are two-way. And I was looking at him and I thought, wow, if I go to this university and if I get a degree, would I want to be living this guy's life? Folks, I was unsure of that. Right? Wall Street doesn't blow up until after Volcker and Reagan tanked the economy. The economy rages back. Right, folks? Look at charts. It's about 1982, where suddenly the economy starts showing profits. The idea of making money trading stock far and above the rate of interest started looking possible. I mean, understand, when the interest rate on treasuries was over 15%, most people weren't getting a 15% rate of return, investing in risk assets. Right? It's the economic turnaround during the first Reagan administration, when we had crazy views out in the public for the first time, the idea of supply-side economics, right? That leads us to the later part of the 80s. In fact, you can tell how different the times were just by looking at the art from the period, right? Early 80s, look at the movies. Look at what was on TV. Now, you did have shows like Dallas. Larry Hagman is J.R. Ewing. right? He's in the oil business, right? He has the glam wife, Sue Ellen. It's a family business. He's dealing with life that way. You had the show Dynasty, right? John Forsythe has the glam wife, Linda Evans. It's a family business, right? He has a son, he has family members, and they're trying to make things work. But understand, outside of these shows where they're trying to talk up oil, right? And at the time, people forget this, Texas was on fire, right? Because the oil business was that big, Texas had one of the biggest endowments in the country. In part because, as we know, oil is viewed as liquid gold, right? When you have a lot of inflation, and when the demand for oil is inelastic, you're going to have an oil boom. But understand, back then, and again, the people to listen to are the Jim Chanoses of the world, the people who got to Wall Street during that era, right? Chanos openly says that he got paid more from a construction job than he got paid from his first job on Wall Street. Well, just to understand what happened. The economy booms. By the time we get to 1987, you have Bud Fox, right, working for Michael Douglas in the movie Wall Street. You had incredible wealth. You had the Hamptons suddenly becoming a go-to spot. Life in New York City changed. Well, fast forward to now. Understand the world's a little bit different. You're coming out of a bull market for equities that's been going on a long time, right? This is the opposite of 1970s, where, you look at these old movies, right? Just think of any black movie from the early part of the 70s, right? Superfly, think about it. He's supposed to be glam, but yet whenever they show you the streets he's traveling on, they look dilapidated. Think about James Bond, Roger Moore, Live and Let Die. The beginning of Live and Let Die has James Bond coming to Harlem. Folks, they're in Harlem. It looks like war-torn Beirut, doesn't it? Right? You look at all these shows from the early 70s. Think about Looking for Mr. Goodbar. You have a public school teacher, and she's living on her own without roommates in Midtown Manhattan. Good luck with that today, right? With all this stock market money, right? Well, understand, things were flat in the 70s. We're coming out of a go-go time, right? Private equity is running big, right? Before, these companies would try to go public early. Now they don't even want to go public. You heard me mention Series A, Series B. Now you're down to Series D, Series E. The early investors want all the profits. Right? They don't go public until the mega profits have been realized. Then the VCs will say, okay, let's go public. Right? It's a different time. Now, what I want people to do, though, is to realize that you have different debt levels. So in the early 80s, to implode the economy, to bleed stagflation out of the American economy, the Fed chair, Volcker, and the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, could say, okay, let's have 15% interest rates. Right? Understand what that means. Mortgage rates completely out of control. Everyone getting raises every few months. That's the early 80s. You can't do that today. Right, folks? Our debt burden is greater than our national defense budget. Right? All this debt that the United States has, believe it or not, this year they're going to have to roll over something like $10 trillion worth of the $36 trillion in debt. The president does not have the option of getting with Fed Chairman Powell and saying, hey, let's bleed this excess out of the economy that's preventing young middle-class kids from buying a house, right, that has multiples on assets so overpriced, right, priced at much higher than the median income than their parents had to pay to buy their first homes. Right? Understand, the high interest rates of the early 80s aren't possible now because of the different debt levels. Right? And so, what can the president do to bleed out stagflation from the economy, to pop bubbles? Right? You heard me mention that housing bubble. Right? It needs to be popped. Let me tell you, there was a time where car loans weren't 7-year loans. Right? You were expected to pay off your car in far less than that. To old-timers watching this video, share some of that information in the comment section of this video, of this YouTube video. So let me tell you what I believe is going on here. I'm not a fan of tariffs. I've said that in numerous videos here online. And I know President Trump has a complete narrative concerning tariffs, of how foreign countries have been exploiting us, and that we need a level playing field. Right? So, of course, I believe the United States has an extremely robust, by world standards, level of trade with Canada. Right? Of course, Trump is threatening tariffs on Canada. Now, for the economists out there, right, and there's a lot of misinformation out on the net. But let me just say this bluntly. The proper response to a foreign country's tariffs, if you want your consumers, your citizens, to get the best deal, is to not levy tariffs yourself. In other words, China has tariffs on American goods being exported to China. That's terrible for the Chinese consumer. Right? But because China's government is making that mistake, it doesn't mean we should. Right? If China wants to give us cheap EVs, we should say thank you very much. Right? That's a higher standard of living for the American consumer. You're then able to take the money you save from buying the cheaper EV, from getting EVs from the low-cost provider, and you're able to spend that money on your kids, their educations, your anniversaries, vacations for the family, clothing, food, furniture, whatever you need. Now, Trump's not taking that path. Let me say this. The father of supply-side economics, Art Laffer, who famously wrote a curve on a dinner napkin. That's the folklore, right? He's still with us. He's still lucid. He's on YouTube. He gives interviews. Art Laffer claims, and he of course knows Donald Trump, they've talked, that Donald Trump privately understands the value of free trade. that Trump's real goal is to have greater free trade. But he needs to have a way to emphasize that. He needs to have a way to get leverage in conversations with foreign powers. So, of course, the T word comes up. Right? Not threats, but tariffs. Well, let me say this. Let me offer a different theory here. Okay? Trump understands that as a president presiding over an overvalued stock market, the Buffett indicator is around 2x, folks. Warren Buffett has an unprecedented cash hoard right now for him. Right? He's been saving up cash so he can go on a shopping spree when prices drop. Right? Just understand, according to the Buffett indicator, the stock market is 2 times as valued as it should be. Right? If you go by the Buffett indicator, you're expecting stocks to drop 50% on average. Right? Well, understand you have a stock market bubble. You have a housing bubble. Not so much these days in Florida, right? Certain areas, the bubble's popping already. But talk with people in their 60s. Ask them, how much did you pay for our family's home? Then ask them, how much were you making at the time? Then do the math. Right? If someone was making $33,000 and they paid $100,000 for the house, that's 3 times their income. Right? For young people today, you're expected to pay 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times your income. Right? You're paying so much of your income to buy the house that you have to take on debt. And of course, handling the debt in this world of increased job insecurity, where you could work for a Mag 7 firm like Meta and then find out that you've been laid off, even as the firm is announcing great quarters. Right? In this world, you understand something is wrong. You don't have the latitude that your parents had when they bought a home. You're operating on no margin. People in their 70s can't even understand these days the cost of school tuition. Right? I'm a season ticket holder at a college, and when I hang out at the college and I look at the kids, I just cannot wrap my head around the idea that these kids are paying on average more than $50,000 per year at school. I just don't know the parents who can afford all that. Right? And I, in my career, deal with some people who have means. Right? So understand what I believe Donald Trump is doing here. He can't use high interest rates to slow down the economy, to pop bubbles that need to be popped. Folks, if in fact the stock market is 100% overvalued, that bubble needs to be popped. Right? If for no other reason than to free up money for other things. Right? Again, education, clothing, vacations, furniture. So what I believe is going on here is what some pundits here on the internet are calling a controlled demolition. Right? Warren G. Harding, early 20s, drops federal spending significantly, slows down the economy, and then the economy bounces back stronger than ever. Right? Ronald Reagan, Paul Volcker. I mentioned Volcker simply because Volcker was a prime architect of all of this. Right? Early 1980s, we had a high misery index. We're coming out of malaise, Jimmy Carter's words. Right? We skipped the 1980 Olympics. American morale was low. Reagan implodes the economy with very high interest rates. The economy bounces back. Donald Trump right now, in my opinion, is using tariffs because he can't use interest rates because we're a debtor nation now. We're no longer a creditor nation. He's imploding the economy. He can't tell you that. He can't, as president, give interviews where he talks about imploding the economy. Right? Instead, he's giving interviews with Maria Bartiromo where he's talking about how no one gets rich with high interest rates, apparently not realizing that bankers get rich with high interest rates, right? But understand, he's hinting that he's going to have low interest rates. Quite frankly, demand is drying up. The consumer is tapped out. But he's going to give the economy a nudge off the cliff. He's doing so by taking our most esteemed trading partners, Canada, Mexico, and he's placing tariffs to slow down trade with those companies. Best case, the bubbles break. Right? Suddenly, stocks are more affordable. Some stocks, right? Keep in mind, it's a market of stocks. It's not a stock market, right? Money pours out of the stock market. Best case, housing drops in value, and people don't blame the government. They can't link tariffs to the popping of the housing bubble. Younger people are able to afford homes again. Right? The economy flounders, unemployment jumps, but it's temporary. Because capital that was misallocated is now being reallocated and better deployed. Trump then can step in and say, okay, we've proven our point with tariffs. Now we have some marginal agreement with Canada, some safe-face agreement with Mexico. Let's get back to free trade. Then we get the 2028 election, right? Ruling party typically loses some seats in the midterms. GOP will lose some seats in 2026. That's my prediction. Right? Keep in mind, there's always that period where government cuts spending. Isn't that what Doge is all about? You even have cuts with the military. Right? Government cuts spending. People lose their jobs. People spend less. There's economic uncertainty. There's some panic. The prices of things like eggs out of control. They start to drop. Prices drop. Capital's redeployed. The economy starts to bounce back. The 2028 election, we'll find out if the economy bounces back in time. In time. For the GOP nominee, whoever that person is, to have a tailwind. Understand, the 1924 election, Calvin Coolidge, the vice president of Warren G. Harding, won that race. Understand, the 1984 election, Ronald Reagan beats Walter Mondale in a landslide, right? Leading us into movies like Wall Street, this whole Hamptons, late 80s, money, 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 Upper East Side, Renaissance in Manhattan era, right? Shows like Odd Mom Out. Later, talking about how expensive it is to live in that world in Manhattan. Keep in mind, it wasn't so long ago that you had the Jennifer Levin, Robert Chambers situation in Manhattan, right? I can tell you when I was growing up, when I was in high school, I was afraid to walk through Central Park at night, right? Old timers remember what Times Square used to be like in the early 1980s, right? You wouldn't want your daughter, your mother walking through Times Square at night, right? By the time I went to a high school reunion years later, Giuliani, Bloomberg had cleaned up Times Square to the point where now you're going to have a big fight in Times Square in boxing in early May. Right, folks? That was unthinkable. That was unthinkable in the early 80s. I'll put it to you this way. I used to go to Times Square for New Year's. Right? That was where, young people would just go to hang out and see the ball drop. And it was dodgy. I remember one year I was standing next to someone. She was about as far away from me as my laptop is to me right now. And someone just came, they called it wilding, and ripped the gold chain off her neck and then kept moving in the crowd. Right? I'm just telling you, the crime rates in Manhattan in the 80s were out of control. Right? This was coming off a flat stock market. By the time you get to the late 80s, there was gentrification all over Manhattan. Right? Times Square now, I haven't been in New York for a minute, but Times Square now, I'm watching it on Law and Order. Right? They have some people in Times Square every other show or so, and it's unrecognizable to me. Right? Well, understand, Trump needs to get there from here. He can't hold a press conference and say, I'm imploding the economy, because there'd be panic. Right? People saying, oh my God, he's imploding the economy. Let me pull my money out of the stock market now. Right? Something Warren Buffett has already done for a lot of his holdings. Right? He can't do that. He doesn't want people panicking and saying, let me sell my home now. Right? Before we have an increase in joblessness and an effort made to slow down the economy. So he's doing it through tariffs. Right? In my eyes, this is a controlled demolition to benefit future generations. Right? You already have technology that's going to displace a lot of workers. The background that I have here was done with AI. If I had this background created a few years ago, I would need to hire a graphic designer. The graphic designer has been disintermediated. Right? Understand, that's the world we're in right now. So, demand has dried up. I'm expecting bubbles to be popped. I'm expecting Trump to talk up tariffs. The key here is to realize that Trump knows that tariffs are detrimental to the standard of living of the American consumer. But he needs to find a way to slow down the economy. Right? Just like Reagan needed that. And used 15% interest rates. Right? We can't afford the high interest rates now. So Trump is doing it with tariffs. That's my theory. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.